And there is this next attack here. These two stacks, 12 combat factors, attacking across a river and in wooded terrain. 3-to-1 attack, but with a -2. So these are the type of attacks that normally the Soviets probably wouldn't make, but at this stage of the game, and because they haven't advanced too far, they will be making this one. So it's a 3-to-1 attack with a -2 die roll modifier. The result is a 4 modified to a 2. Defender retreats 1 hex. So the sole defending unit is retreated 1 hex and is flipped to its disrupted side. And now the Soviets can advance. They advance 2 units into the vacated hex, but now the breakthrough unit, the one in brown, can advance 1 more hex if it doesn't enter an enemy zone of control. And remember, disrupted units do not have zones of control. So the breakthrough unit just advances 1 more hex, and that's the end of that combat situation. We have another one. Here we see these 2 stacks of Soviet units, 12 combat factors against 4. The Germans are not in any specific terrain that would give them any benefit, so it is a 3-to-1 attack with no modification. We roll 1d6, and the result is a 3. Defender retreats 1 hex. Defender is retreated into the only hex it can retreat. It is inverted to its disrupted side, and the Soviets advance into the vacated hex. And that's the end of the attacks by the Kalinin front. We've seen attacks by WR front, and the Soviets do not have any more activation points. So now we move to the First Shock Army withdrawal phase. And in this turn we've seen successful Soviet attacks which have caused certain discomfort on the German line, especially in the ranks of the 9th Army. And that's thanks in part to the attack by the First Shock Army. If this army is not withdrawn now, the Soviets will lose at least 3 victory points, because it will be staying there for at least turn 6. So this is the time where we say goodbye to the First Shock Army, so the Soviets withdraw it. And we remove it permanently from the game. It doesn't count as an eliminated unit, but it scores or deprives the Soviets of 2 victory points because it overstayed for 2 turns. Now we move on to the airborne phase. The Soviets may use now the airborne unit. If they decide to do so, it may be placed in any clear terrain hex within 20 hexes of the eastern edge. So will they use that unit now, especially after those fruitful attacks? And after surmising the situation on the 9th Army sector, which has a substantial number of units disrupted, and to give even more momentum to that attack by the Kalinin and Western fronts, we will be airdropping the unit in this turn. So we pick the airborne unit, and I've counted 20 hexes from the edge, and it would be up to this column here. Obviously the Soviets don't want to drop their airborne unit too far away from their own lines, just close enough so that they can do some harm, and they cannot be dropped in a hex in enemy zone of control. But disrupted units have no such zone of control. So the airborne unit will be airdropped in the clear hex to the northwest of Sichevka, which is a victory point city for the Germans. And the idea is here to cause some havoc among those German units that are facing the units of the WR front. So the airborne unit makes its airdrop to the northwest of Sichevka. Now on to the partisan phase. We roll 1d6 to see in which partisan area this unit appears. And the roll is a 1. So where is partisan area 1? It's actually pretty far away from the current action. And here we see that wooded area. And we see the partisans popping up there. They won't be bothering the Germans too much for now. Now to the Soviet recovery phase. The Soviets do not have any disrupted units on the map. So there are no units to flip to their good order side. And that is the end of Soviet turn number 5. And now we proceed to German turn number 5. The Germans receive 5 activation points. And they didn't save any from the prior turn, so they only have these 5 for this turn. On to the German movement phase. The Germans have a stretched line of units here by the 2nd Panzer Army. And maybe it's time for them to fall back to a shorter line here in front of Bryansk. And that will allow the Germans maybe to execute some counterattacks in the vicinity of Kirov. We see this bulge of Russian units from the WL front that has formed here. The Germans have a pretty hefty concentration of infantry there that may be needed somewhere else, and that somewhere else is in the sector of the 4th Panzer Army and the 9th Army. Especially the 9th Army took a beating last turn, and we see that it has many of its units disrupted. There's a Soviet airborne unit here behind enemy lines, 1 hex away from Sychevka, which is worth a victory point. And further to the north, the northwestern front wasn't able to attack last turn, so the Germans may consolidate their positions even more. The Germans use their first activation point to activate the units of the 2nd Panzer Army for movement. Here we see the southernmost units of the 2nd Panzer Army before movement. And here we see the positions after movement. They have fallen back completely. In real life, probably Hitler wouldn't allow this. They're giving up Orel, which will deprive them of scoring 2 victory points. But they will be able to form a much shorter and stronger line. And it's going to be a tough proposition for the Soviets to take Bryansk with the forces they have in the area around this part of the map. Now we see this unit of the formation, the 4th Panzer Division, took a position to surround this weak Soviet infantry unit. Yet to move are these 2 units. This unit will not move, but this 18th Panzer Division will take a position here in the woods to aid in the attack against the weak Soviet unit. That, of course, leaves Kirov unguarded, but we will be shifting forces of the 4th Army, which will move now and will take that position vacated by the 4th Panzer Army in Kirov. So the Germans spend their 2nd activation point to activate the units of the 4th Army for movement. Here we see the 4th Army mostly concentrated in this area, also holding the line here across the river from Medin. And this is another situation where the Germans can fall back in the direction of Yuknov to form a shorter line and also strengthen their position here in Kirov, which is sort of like the gateway to the next important city here, Roslav, as well as Spas-Demensk. So let's see the movement of the units of the 4th Army. This is before movement. And here are the positions after movement, obviously falling back, forming a more compact line to be able later on, in another turn, to be able to shift their reserves even further to the western side here, where the Soviets still have a fair number of units concentrated there. So that's the movement of the 4th Army. And next to move, obviously, is the 4th Panzer Army. which appears to be still solid behind that river there. But because of the collapse of the 9th Army on its left flank, it may have to give up some ground. So the Germans spend their third activation point to activate the units of the 4th Panzer Army for movement. And here we see the positions before movement and now after movement. Notice that the Germans are not giving up Gazatsk. They're placing a defensive line and stacking forces behind the river. And we see the positions here also taking advantage of the forest. Now, the next challenge that the Germans have is to see how they're going to deal with that parachute unit that has dropped behind enemy lines amidst a group of disrupted German units that cannot move during this turn. So it's the 9th Army's turn to move, and the 9th Army has many of its units disrupted. So only 2 activation points left, and the next to last activation point is to activate the 9th Army for movement. The 9th Army has 8 units here remaining, 5 of which are disrupted. They cannot move, and the 110th Infantry Division is dangerously detached from the rest of the German units. So that unit needs saving. So these are the positions before movement. Positions after movement. This unit has moved to this location, which has at least a protection on 2 sides of the river, and the detached 110th has moved closer to the city of Sichevka, which technically is still in German hands, even though the hex is empty and the paratroopers are adjacent. As we can see by the movements of the 4th Panzer and 9th Armies, the Germans have elected not to attack the parachute unit, and it's been left behind enemy lines. Obviously, the 9th Army didn't have any strength or units in the vicinity to attack. So this may cause problems for the Germans in the next turn, and the Germans only have 1 activation point left. Here's the situation in the northmost part of the map. The R units here of this German formation are holding barely the line, and we can see from the Russian positions that if nothing else happens, the Russians will be attacking in force against these 2 units. The Germans spend their last activation point to activate the units of the R formation or reserve for movement. Here we see the positions of the R group, reserve group I call it. They are holding the line, and you see that if they stay in place, they will be attacked by a substantial number of Soviet units of the Northwestern Front. So the Germans will be activating the R group, and these units will be falling back. By doing so, they force the Soviets to spend extra activation points, 1 to again move into attacking positions, and another 1 to attack. Also, this formation has to help out in some way the hard-pressed German 9th Army, and we may see units going into their direction in order to hold the line. The German 9th Army is hard-pressed with many units that are disrupted. Here we see the positions of the R group after movement, and they have fallen back, and we see also that there are units from that same group in other parts of the map, like 2 German divisions near Smolensk. So these will now move towards the east, and they reach Yartsevo. Also, there is a German infantry division near Vyazma, and that unit will be sent north to try to trap the Soviet parachute unit that was airdropped in this turn. So the unit moves and completely surrounds now the Soviet paratroopers. The disrupted units will be flipping to their undisrupted sides at the end of this turn. And finally, the last unit of this formation that has yet to move, the 208th German Infantry Division, now will move and set itself in the victory point city of Spasdemensk. And that concludes the German movement phase for turn number 5. Now we proceed to the German combat phase. The Germans have no activation points left. It doesn't mean that they cannot initiate attacks. By special rule, the German panzer divisions, those that are have the black background, can attack without activation points. So we see here in the 4th Panzer Army sector, there's a significant number of panzer divisions in Gazatsk and also to the south. However, the combat odds there do not favor the Germans, so these will not be attacking at this time. Another possible combat situation is shown here to the southwest of Kirov. There are 2 panzer divisions which are adjacent to this weak Soviet unit. They could attack. It would be a 2-to-1 attack with a -1 because the defenders are in forest. So it is a pretty risky attack, but any result involving a defender retreat will cause the unit's elimination. Note that this unit is not isolated because it can trace a line of communication through zones of control here because this hex is occupied by friendly units, so the Germans don't get a +1 for defender isolation. So the Germans are considering a 2-to-1 attack with a -1 die roll modifier. Now, as you can see here, this is a pretty risky proposition. It means that the best result they can obtain is this 5. And the worst result is a 0. So 0, 1, and 2 involve the Germans retreating. This AL asterisk result is normally attacker loses 1 unit, but the Germans can treat it as an attacker retreat. And this result does not destroy the defenders' contact. So the Germans would have to roll 5 or 6, and then we apply the -1 to get any one of these 2 DR1 results, which would destroy the Soviet unit. Well, the Germans decide not to attack in order to preserve what they still believe to be a pretty decent line there in the southernmost sector of the map. So there's no combat in this combat phase. Next, the German recovery phase. The Germans have a substantial number of units from the 9th Army which are disrupted, and at this time they are flipped to their non-disrupted sides. As you can see, the Soviet parachute unit is now in dire straits, but of course there's a horde of Russian units from the Kalinin and WR fronts which are coming to the rescue. And this is the end of German turn number 5. Now, let's take a little time to tally the victory points so far, because remember, in this game, unless there's an automatic victory by either side, the side that has the most victory points wins. And we don't foresee an automatic victory. For that, a side would have to capture the supply hexes of the other. That means all the supply hexes that are on the other side of the board. So let's take a look first at the victory points which are earned by eliminating enemy units. In this game, each side earns 1 victory point for every 5 enemy units eliminated. So the Russians earn 1, 2, and 3 victory points for 15 German units eliminated. They have eliminated 1 more, 16, but that fraction doesn't count. So 3 victory points for the Soviets on account of German unit elimination. The Germans, on the other hand, have eliminated only 4 Soviet units, so they don't receive any victory points on account of enemy unit elimination. Now in this game, the sides receive victory points by controlling cities with victory point numbers in their color. So the Germans receive victory points if they hold on to cities with black victory point numbers, and the Soviets, on the other hand, only receive victory points by controlling cities with red victory point numbers. So you see that the game forces the Soviet player to push eastward, because he's only going to score victory points on account of cities for these cities that are in the left side of the board. If he just tries to eliminate German units and nothing else, the Germans will win on account of holding on to the victory point cities in their color, in gray. So let's tally the victory point cities held by the Germans at this time. And I've placed little poles on those cities to make them easier to identify. You see that Kirov, even though there's been a lot of fighting around it, is not a victory point city. We start with Yukhnov, held by the 4th Army. It's worth 1 victory point. And Vyazma is worth 2, so we're at 3. Gazatsk is worth 2, so we're right now at 5. And we see the city there that the Soviet paratroops landed very close to. Vychevka is worth 1 victory point, so we are currently at 6. We see Nelidovo worth 1, so we're at 7. And Andreapol is not a victory point city, but we see here moving towards the east, Velikie Luki is worth 1, so we're at 8. And finally, in the north edge of the board, Kolm is worth 2, so that's 10 victory points for the Germans on account of holding on to their victory point cities. So the Germans have 10 victory points. All of these are the product of holding on to victory point cities in their color. The Soviets, on the other hand, have scored 3 victory points on account of destroying German units, but 1 victory point has to be deducted because the First Shock Army was withdrawn in turn 5. If it would have been withdrawn in turn 4, there would have been no victory point penalty. So the score is currently the Germans 10 and the Soviets 2. And as you can see, this game places a premium on the Soviets to penetrate deep behind German lines, not only to deprive the Germans of scoring victory points for these cities in black, but also for allowing the Soviet player to score victory points for themselves. And as you can see, destroying enemy units is hard. And destroying 5 of them will only get a victory point, while capturing some of these cities can net a substantial number. So capturing cities appears to be the way to go. And the Soviets have not been able to do that much. It's costing them a lot of effort and time. And I believe they're losing the game right now. So unless they achieve some major breakthroughs, this may hold out to be a German victory at the end. We see that there is an interesting situation that has developed behind German lines with the Russian or Soviet parachute unit surrounded, and there's a horde of Russian units coming to the rescue. So that may produce some retreat results against these units that they may not be able to fulfill, and they may be eliminated. So this surrounding of the parachute corps may come as a blessing for the Soviets if they achieve the correct retreat results. So let's see what happens in turn number 6 of Red Typhoon. This is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.